The first light of dawn had barely touched the horizon when Thomas Miller stepped onto the porch of his farmhouse in western Kansas. The morning air was cool, carrying the familiar scent of earth and wheat fields. In the distance, the sky glowed orange and pink, stretching over miles of open land. Thomas took a sip of coffee and looked across his property. For as long as he could remember, his family had farmed this land. His grandfather had arrived in Kansas with little more than a horse and a wagon. His father had expanded the farm, and now it belonged to Thomas. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. "You're up early again," his wife Mary said with a smile. Thomas chuckled. "Farmers don't get to sleep in." Mary handed him a plate with toast and eggs. "You should eat before you head out," he nodded. "The north field needs checking. The wheat looked dry yesterday." Mary frowned. Still no rain in the forecast. Not for another week, according to the radio. She looked out at the fields and sighed. Let's hope they're wrong. Inside the house, their son Jake, 16, rushed down the stairs, still buttoning his shirt. "Dad, can I drive the tractor after school today?" Thomas laughed. "Only if you finish your homework first." "Deal." His younger sister Emily rolled her eyes from the kitchen table. "All Jake thinks about is tractors." Jake grinned. "And all you think about is your books." "Books are useful, so are tractors." Mary shook her head. "Enough, both of you. Eat breakfast." The family laughed, unaware that the coming months would test them in ways they had never imagined. Spring usually brought gentle rains to Kansas, but this year was different. Days turned into weeks without a single drop of water. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the soil began to crack. One afternoon, Thomas drove his truck into town and stopped at the local diner. Inside, farmers sat in booths, drinking coffee and discussing the weather. "Morning, Tom," called Frank Wilson, his oldest friend and neighbor. Thomas slid into the booth across from him. "Any good news?" Frank shook his head. "Not unless you've learned how to make it rain." The waitress, Susan, poured Thomas a cup of coffee. "You farmers all look worried," she said. "We have reason to be," Frank replied. "If this drought keeps up, we're in trouble." At the counter, old Walter Jenkins, who had farmed for nearly 50 years, turned around. "I've seen dry years before," Walter said. "The land has a way of testing people." Thomas nodded. "And what happens if we fail the test?" Walter smiled faintly. "Then we help each other pass." The words stayed with Thomas as he drove back home. By June, the wheat had begun to wilt. Every day, Thomas walked the fields, studying the yellowing plants. Jake followed behind him. "How bad is it?" the boy asked. Thomas knelt and crumbled dry soil in his hand. "Bad enough." Jake kicked at the dirt. "Will we lose everything?" Thomas stood and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "We're not giving up yet." "But what if the rain never comes?" Thomas looked toward the horizon. "Then we'll find another way." That night, the family sat around the dinner table in silence. Mary finally spoke. "The bank called." Thomas looked up. "What did they say?" "They're worried about the loan payments." Jake and Emily exchanged nervous glances. Thomas pushed his plate away. "We'll manage." Mary lowered her voice. "Thomas, we've already spent most of our savings." For a moment, nobody said anything. Then Emily asked quietly, "Are we going to lose the farm?" Thomas forced a smile. "No, this farm has been in our family for 3 generations. We're going to fight for it." The next morning, Thomas drove to Frank's farm. Frank was repairing a fence when Thomas arrived. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." Frank set down his hammer. "Come on, let's talk." The two men sat beneath an old oak tree. "The wheat's dying," Thomas admitted. "The bank wants its money, and I don't know what to do." Frank was silent for a moment. "You're not alone, Tom. Sometimes it feels that way." Frank shook his head. "Remember when my barn burned down 10 years ago?" Thomas nodded. "Who helped me rebuild it?" "The whole town." "Exactly. People around here look after each other." Thomas stared at the fields. "I don't want charity." "It's not charity, it's community." Before Thomas could answer, Frank's daughter Lucy ran toward them. "Dad, Mom says lunch is ready." Frank stood. "Come eat with us." Thomas smiled weakly. "Thanks. The drought grew worse in July. The local river shrank to a narrow stream. Dust storms swept across the plains, coating everything in brown dirt. One evening, Thomas sat on the porch alone. Jake joined him. "Dad? Yeah, I heard Mum talking to Aunt Sarah." Thomas looked over. "What did she say?" "That she's scared." Thomas stared into the darkness. "Your mother has every right to be scared." Jake hesitated. "I'm scared too." Thomas put an arm around his son. "When I was your age, Grandpa told me something." "What?" "He said courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing the right thing even when you're afraid." Jake nodded slowly. "Do you think we'll make it?" Thomas looked up at the stars. "I honestly don't know." For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure. A week later, Thomas woke to the sound of engines outside. He stepped onto the porch and froze. 3 pickup trucks were parked in his driveway. Frank climbed out of the first truck. Behind him came Walter Jenkins, Susan's husband Mike, and several other neighbors. Thomas walked toward them. "What's going on?" Frank smiled. "We're here to help." Thomas frowned. "Help with what?" "Everything." Walter pointed toward the broken irrigation system. "We brought tools." Mike opened the back of his truck. "And spare parts." Susan handed Mary several boxes of food. "You're going to need this." Thomas was speechless. "You don't have to do this." Frank laughed. "Too late. We're already here." For the next several days, the farm became a center of activity. Men repaired pipes and tractors. Women prepared meals, children carried equipment, and filled water containers. Emily spent the afternoon helping Lucy paint signs to mark damaged areas of the fields. Jake worked beside his father from sunrise until sunset. Late one evening, Thomas stood with Frank near the barn. "I don't know how to thank everyone." Frank shrugged. "You'd do the same for us." Thomas smiled. "Yeah, I guess I would." August arrived, bringing even hotter weather. Despite everyone's efforts, the wheat continued to struggle. One afternoon, Thomas gathered the family in the living room. "We need to prepare for the possibility that the harvest won't be enough." Mary nodded sadly. Jake looked down. Emily crossed her arms. "So what do we do?" Thomas took a deep breath. "We keep going." Mary squeezed his hand. "We'll get through this together." Suddenly, Jake ran to the window. "Dad!" Thomas stood. "What is it?" Jake pointed toward the western sky. Dark clouds were gathering in the distance. At first, nobody spoke. Then Emily whispered, "Rain?" Thomas stepped outside. Thunder rolled across the plains. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of wet earth. For several minutes, the family simply watched. Then the first drop fell. Jake laughed. Another drop landed on Mary's hand. Within seconds, rain poured from the sky. Emily spun in circles, shouting with excitement. Mary hugged Thomas tightly. "We made it." Thomas could barely speak. Across the road, neighbors emerged from their homes, cheering and laughing. Children danced in the mud while farmers stood silently, letting the rain soak their clothes. Frank drove up in his truck and leaned out the window. "Looks like the forecast was wrong after all." Thomas laughed for the first time in months. "Best mistake they've ever made." August arrived, bringing even hotter weather. Despite everyone's efforts, the wheat continued to struggle. One afternoon, Thomas gathered the family in the living room. "We need to prepare for the possibility that the harvest won't be enough." Mary nodded sadly. Jake looked down. Emily crossed her arms. "So what do we do?" Thomas took a deep breath. "We keep going." Mary squeezed his hand. "We'll get through this together." Suddenly, Jake ran to the window. "Dad!" Thomas stood. "What is it?" Jake pointed toward the western sky. Dark clouds were gathering in the distance. At first, nobody spoke. Then Emily whispered, "Rain?" Thomas stepped outside. Thunder rolled across the plains. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of wet earth. For several minutes, the family simply watched. Then the first drop fell. Jake laughed. Another drop landed on Mary's hand. Within seconds, rain poured from the sky. Emily spun in circles, shouting with excitement. Mary hugged Thomas tightly. "We made it." Thomas could barely speak. Across the road, neighbors emerged from their homes, cheering and laughing. Children danced in the mud while farmers stood silently, letting the rain soak their clothes. Frank drove up in his truck and leaned out the window. "Looks like the forecast was wrong after all." Thomas laughed for the first time in months. "Best mistake they've ever made." The rain continued through the night and into the next day. Although some of the crop had been lost, much of it survived. Weeks later, harvest season arrived. Golden wheat stretched across the fields, shining beneath the autumn sun. The entire community gathered to help bring in the harvest. Tractors rolled across the land, while families shared meals and stories. As the sun set, everyone gathered near the barn for a celebration. Walter raised a glass of lemonade. To Thomas and his family, everyone cheered. Walter continued, "This year reminded us that no farmer succeeds alone. The land may belong to one family, but a community keeps it alive." Frank raised his glass. "To neighbors! To neighbors!" everyone shouted. Thomas looked around at the faces illuminated by the evening light, his wife, his children, his friends, and the people who had stood beside him when times were hardest. He stepped forward. "I spent months thinking I had to save this farm by myself," he said. "I was wrong. We saved it together." The crowd applauded. Thomas glanced at Jake and Emily. "One day, this farm may belong to the next generation. I hope they remember what we've learned this year, that hard work matters, determination matters, but people matter most." Mary smiled. As darkness settled over the Kansas plains, laughter echoed across the fields. The drought had taken much from them, but it had also given them something valuable, a deeper understanding of friendship, family, and the strength of a community that refused to give up. And for Thomas Miller, that was worth more than any harvest.